It all started when Mark opened his monthly water bill and nearly dropped the envelope out of shock. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and read the numbers again, thinking maybe he miscalculated or the company had made a mistake. The amount was almost double what he usually paid, and there was no reasonable explanation. His household habits hadn't changed. He lived alone, didn't have a pool, and his sprinklers ran on the same schedule they always had. Something wasn't right at first. Mark brushed it off as a possible error on the utility company's end. He called them immediately, and after sitting through a long hold, a polite customer service agent explained that the reading was accurate. No mistake, no glitch. The water had indeed been used. Mark hung up, feeling unsettled. If the bill was correct, then where on earth was all that extra water going? The next morning he walked around his property with a notepad, jotting down anything unusual. He crouched near the sprinkler lines, checked the faucet connections, and even crawled into the bushes to examine the piping. Everything looked normal. No leaks, no broken heads, nothing that would justify gallons of missing water. He thought about hiring a plumber, but decided to wait a few more days. Maybe it was just a one-time spike. But the following week, another strange thing happened. Mark stepped out to fetch the mail in the early evening, and as he walked across his front lawn, his shoe sank into a damp patch of soil. He frowned, looking around. The sprinklers hadn't run since early morning, and the grass should have been dry by now. Confused, he knelt down, touched the soil, and felt the unmistakable coolness of fresh water. It wasn't just one patch either. There were several wet spots across his yard, as if someone had been watering when he wasn't looking. That night he went to bed with the windows cracked open. Around midnight, he stirred awake to the faint sound of running water outside. It wasn't the steady tick-tick-tick of his sprinkler system, but more like the flow of a hose or faucet left on. He sat up, straining his ears, but by the time he slipped on his slippers and padded outside, the noise was gone. The air was still, the yard was dark, nothing seemed out of place. Mark couldn't shake the feeling something sneaky was going on. Over the next few days, he paid closer attention. His suspicion grew stronger each time he looked across the street at his neighbor Karen's yard. Karen was a character. She was the type of neighbor everyone knew, but nobody really liked. Loud, nosy, and endlessly self-important. She had somehow gotten herself onto the HOA board and used it as a weapon to bully people. If a trash can was left out for too long, she'd write it up. If a car was parked an inch over the line, she'd threaten fines. She lived for confrontation and attention. What made Mark raise an eyebrow was the state of her yard. Her grass had been patchy and her flowers droopy. Karen wasn't exactly known for her green thumb, yet suddenly, within the past 2 weeks, her lawn looked like a glossy magazine photo. Thick, green grass, vibrant flowers, and her bushes trimmed neatly. It was as if her yard had been given a miracle drink. She strutted around like a queen, bragging to neighbors about how her gardening skills had paid off. But Mark couldn't help but wonder how someone who never seemed to water her plants could suddenly have the healthiest yard on the block. One evening, while walking his dog along the sidewalk, Mark slowed down near Karen's fence. He noticed that the strip of grass along the property line seemed unnaturally wet on both sides. His own soil was damp, but so was hers, as if the water had traveled underneath. His mind clicked into place. Was she stealing his water? Sounded crazy. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Mark decided to test the idea. The next morning, he carefully noted the exact position of his sprinkler valve and checked the pressure gauge. Later that night, he checked again. The valve was slightly off. His pulse quickened. Someone had touched it. He crouched down and spotted faint footprints in the soil, nearby too large to be from a stray animal, too deliberate to be random. He even noticed faint drag marks in the dirt leading toward the fence that separated his yard from Karen's. The puzzle pieces were falling together. Still, Mark wanted undeniable proof. So he set his alarm extra early one morning, long before sunrise, and parked his car around the corner as if he was leaving for work. Instead of driving off, he slipped back quietly on foot and hid behind the hedge near his porch. His heart beat fast with anticipation. For half an hour, Nothing happened. Then, just as the sky began to lighten, he saw Karen appear on her side of the fence. She was wearing gardening gloves and carried a coiled green hose. Mark squinted, watching her every move. She crouched near his sprinkler valve, fiddled for a moment, and then unbelievably attached her hose to a splitter she had secretly installed on his line. His jaw dropped. She twisted the knob, and water gushed out, flowing into her hose and onto her flower beds. Mark's blood boiled. There she was, stealing his water in broad daylight, acting as if she owned it. He couldn't stay hidden any longer. He stepped out from behind the hedge and shouted, "What do you think you're doing?" Karen froze like a child caught with her hand in the cookie jar. Then, in an instant, she puffed herself up and turned defensive. "Excuse me?" "This is common property," she snapped, waving her gloved hand. "As a board member, I have permission to make sure the neighborhood looks presentable. Your water line is right here, so I'm just making use of it for the community." Mark couldn't believe what he was hearing. "This is my private line, Karen. You can't just hook up your hose and run my water. You're literally stealing." Karen rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, please, don't be so dramatic. It's just a little water, and frankly, you should be grateful. I'm making the neighborhood prettier. If you complain, I'll have to bring up your overgrown hedge at the next HOA meeting. You know that's against guidelines, right?" Mark clenched his fists. She wasn't just stealing, she was threatening him. Realized then that arguing with her would go nowhere. She'd twist his words, maybe even try to fine him. She was the type of person who thrived on intimidation. If he wanted to stop this, he'd need to outsmart her. So with controlled calm, Mark simply said, "Fine, Karen, do what you want." He turned and walked back inside, leaving her standing smugly with the hose in hand. But in his mind, a plan was already forming. If Karen wanted to keep stealing his water, she was going to regret every drop. Mark could hardly sleep that night. The image of Karen crouching by his sprinkler valve, shamelessly hooking up her hose, replayed over and over in his mind. It was one thing to suspect she was stealing from him, but seeing it with his own eyes made his anger boil in a way he hadn't felt in years. Still, he kept telling himself he couldn't act rashly. If he confronted her in front of the HOA or tried to take her to court without proof, she would just deny everything. Worse, she might spin it around and make him look like the bad guy. She had a reputation for twisting situations in her favor, and many neighbors were too afraid of her to speak up. He knew he had to be patient and gather undeniable evidence. The next morning, he went outside with his coffee and crouched near the sprinkler box again. Sure enough, there were fresh footprints in the soil, pressed deeper than before because the dirt was damp from her midnight watering. He noticed small scratches on the lid of the valve box, too, as if it had been opened and closed carelessly. He knelt there quietly, feeling his heart beat faster. It wasn't his imagination. Karen had been tampering with his property, and she had no shame about it. He looked toward her yard and saw her flowers practically glowing in the morning sun. Bright reds, deep purples, and thick green stems that looked like they'd been fed fertilizer and rainwater every day. She stood there proudly, sipping from her mug, and waved to another neighbor as if she had done all this herself. Mark almost laughed at the irony. That day, he bought a small notebook to use as a journal. Every time he noticed something suspicious, he wrote it down. Dates, times, conditions of the soil, even small details like the smell of damp earth in the air. Felt tedious, but he knew these little observations could one day help him prove his case. One evening, as he bent to check the valve, he noticed faint drag marks leading directly toward the fence that separated their properties. The line wasn't obvious, but to someone paying attention, it looked like a hose had been dragged along. The ground? He crouched lower and followed it with his eyes, realizing it lined up perfectly with the corner of Karen's garden where her biggest flower patch sat. It was almost laughable. She wasn't even trying to cover her tracks. A few nights later, Mark decided to test his theory again, set his sprinklers to run on a different schedule than usual, then went outside afterward to check if the soil had dried properly. When he returned the next morning, he found new wet spots in the yard, despite no sprinklers running overnight. That was the proof he needed. Karen was sneaking over at night or early morning, running his water without him. Knowing the unfairness of it all gnawed at him, He was paying hard-earned money every month for her to enjoy the benefits. Thought about the rising bills, about the principle of the matter, and about how smug she had looked when she told him she had permission as a board member. He clenched his jaw and promised himself that soon she'd regret it. One particularly early morning, Mark decided it was time to set a trap. He set his alarm for 4:45 a.m. and forced himself out of bed, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He quietly left the house, parked his car around the corner, and walked back to his property on foot, making sure not to be seen. He hid behind the thick hedge near his porch, crouching low, with only the faint glow of the streetlight illuminating the quiet street. The neighborhood was still asleep, no sound except the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of wind through the trees. He felt his pulse quicken with anticipation. For half an hour, nothing happened. The sky slowly began to lighten with hints of pink and gray. Mark almost thought she wouldn't show, but then, just as he shifted his weight to stand, he saw movement. Karen appeared from her side of the fence, wearing old gardening gloves and carrying a green hose coiled over her shoulder. She looked around quickly, as if making sure no one was watching, then crouched by the valve box. Mark held his breath, his hands clenching into fists as he watched her. She fiddled with the valve, twisted something, and then just as he suspected attached her hose to a small splitter she had secretly installed on his line. The water rushed out into her hose, and she began dragging it across her yard to water her flower beds. She hummed softly as if this was the most natural thing in the world. The sight made Mark's stomach turn. It wasn't just the act of stealing it, it was the boldness, the entitlement. She was standing there on his property, using his resources, acting like she had every right. He stepped out from behind the hedge before he could stop himself. His voice rang out louder than he expected. "What do you think you're doing?" Karen jumped, nearly dropping the hose. For a split second, she looked guilty, caught in the act like a thief. But then her expression hardened, and she quickly shifted into her usual arrogant mask. "Excuse me?" she said, straightening her back. "I'm making sure the neighborhood stays presentable. Someone has to do it." Mark stared at her in disbelief. "That's my water. You hooked your hose to my line. Do you really think that's okay?" She rolled her eyes, scoffing, as if he were the unreasonable one. "Oh, please, don't be so dramatic. It's just water. And as a board member, I have the authority to make certain decisions for the good of the community. Honestly, you should be thanking me. Look at how beautiful the neighborhood looks." She gestured proudly toward her flowers, as if they were proof of her civic duty. Mark felt heat rise in his chest. "Authority doesn't give you the right to steal from me. You're running up my bills while you brag about how great your garden looks. You think that's fair?" Karen's lips curled into a smirk. "Fair. Life isn't about fair, Mark. It's about keeping standards. And if you're going to be petty about a few gallons of water, maybe I should bring up your hedges at the next HOA meeting. You're starting to look overgrown, you know. That's against the guidelines. Wouldn't want to get fined, would you?" Her words were sharp, dripping with arrogance. It was clear she wasn't going to admit fault, let alone stop. She thrived on intimidation, and had learned that most neighbors backed down when she pulled out HOA threats. Mark wanted to yell too, rip the hose from her hands, to drag her into the middle of the street and show the world what kind of person she really was. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't work. She'd just twist the story, claim he harassed her, maybe even file a complaint against him. Fighting fire with fire wouldn't solve this. So instead, Mark took a deep breath and forced himself to stay calm. "Fine, Karen," he said in a measured tone, his eyes never leaving hers. "Do what you want." Without another word, he turned and walked back inside, leaving her standing there with the hose. He could almost feel her smug smile burning into his back, certain she had one. But what Karen didn't know was that Mark was already forming a plan that would turn her arrogance against her in a way she could never deny. For the rest of the day, Mark thought carefully about his next move. If she wanted to keep stealing his water, he would let her. In fact, he would make sure she did. But when she did, she would be in for a surprise so big, so humiliating, that she'd wish she had never touched his sprinkler line in the first place. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Mark spent the next few days replaying his early morning confrontation with Karen in his head. The way she had looked him straight in the eye, hose in hand, and acted like she had every right to take his water, it made his blood boil. She hadn't even tried to apologize or cover up her actions. Instead, she threatened him with fake HOA rules and fines, twisting the situation so she came out looking powerful. Mark knew he couldn't let her win. He needed a plan, one that would make her regret every drop of water she stole from him. But it had to be clever. If he went straight to the HOA without undeniable proof, she'd deny everything, accuse him of harassment, and maybe even get him fined for something ridiculous. He needed a way to not just catch her in the act, but also humiliate her enough that she'd never dare mess with him again. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open, typing in searches, "safe prank for water thieves." How to catch a neighbor stealing sprinkler water, harmless but visible, die for water. At first, the results were silly people dumping soap into fountains or adding food coloring to water jugs. But then he came across lawn-safe marking. Die. Landscapers used it to show where they had sprayed fertilizer or weed killer. It was non-toxic, biodegradable, and left a bright, visible color in water. His eyes lit up as he read more. Mixed into a sprinkler system, it wouldn't harm the grass or soil, but it would definitely stain anything it touched for a while. Patio. Stones, shoes, clothes. Once the water touched them, it would leave marks. He could practically picture Karen's fancy garden walkway covered in blotchy colors, but he didn't stop there. He wanted more than just color. He wanted something Karen couldn't ignore. That's when he remembered vinegar. It was safe, cheap, and had a smell so strong it clung to everything. He knew it wouldn't hurt his lawn. It might even kill HOA. Few weeds, but when sprayed through a hose, the sour stench would be impossible to ignore. The idea made him smile for the first time in days. If she wanted to keep stealing his water, she was about to steal a mixture of dye and vinegar that would turn her yard into a mess and make the whole neighborhood wrinkle their noses. The next morning, Mark drove to a hardware store and wandered the aisles until he found exactly what he needed. A bottle of bright blue lawn dye sat on the shelf, next to others in green and red. He grabbed the blue one, thinking it would show up clearly against Karen's white stepping stones and pale patio furniture. In another aisle, he picked up several gallons of vinegar. He carried the supplies to the register, feeling almost giddy. The cashier gave him a strange look as he unloaded multiple gallons of vinegar, but he just shrugged it off with a polite smile. If only she knew the purpose. Back at home, Mark carefully tested the mixture. He filled a bucket with water, added some vinegar, and then poured in a small amount of dye. The water turned a bright, almost electric blue, and when he dipped an old rag into it, the color clung stubbornly. The smell of vinegar filled the air, sharp and sour, making him wrinkle his nose and laugh to himself. Perfect. It was exactly what he needed, strong. It's obvious, and most importantly, harmless to plants. And soil, Karen wouldn't be able to claim permanent damage. She'd just be left embarrassed. That evening, when the sun went down, Mark got to work. He waited until the neighborhood was quiet, then went out to his sprinkler system. With a flashlight between his teeth, he poured the vinegar and dye mixture into the irrigation line. He made sure the mix would stay there, sitting and waiting like a trap. He adjusted the timing so that the treated water wouldn't run during his normal schedule, but would be ready to flow if someone manually turned on the line. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the setup, feeling both nervous and excited. For days he had been angry and frustrated, but now he felt in control again. If Karen wanted to keep stealing, she was about to catch herself in the act. The next morning, Mark checked the soil near the valve box and found more footprints. She was still sneaking over, still convinced she had outsmarted him. That only made him more determined. He decided to set up cameras too, just to make sure nothing could be denied. He bought a small motion sensor camera that blended in with the bushes near the sprinkler line. He positioned another one facing his porch so he could catch her coming over from her side. Tested them both, making sure the video was clear. Watching the little red light blink as it recorded gave him a sense of satisfaction. Not only would Karen be caught blue-handed literally, but he'd also have the video evidence to prove it. That night, he barely slept. He kept imagining her reaction, the shock on her face, the way she'd shriek when the smell of vinegar hit her nose, the sight of her white stones turning bright blue under her feet. He lay in bed smiling, listening for the faint sound of running water. Just before dawn, he heard the hiss of a hose. He slipped out of bed, quietly moved to his porch, and peeked out from behind the curtain. There she was, just as he expected, crouching at the valve box with her green hose connected. She twisted the splitter, water rushed through, and she dragged the hose toward her yard. Mark felt a surge of anticipation. Any second now, the trap would spring. Sure enough, within minutes, he saw the blue water splattering across her flower beds. The bright color spread like spilled paint, staining her white stepping stones and dripping onto her patio chairs. Even from his porch, he could smell the vinegar, sharp and sour, carried by the morning breeze. Karen paused, sniffed the air, and frowned. Then she looked down at her feet and let out a shriek that pierced the quiet neighborhood. Her shoes were splattered with blue dye, and the stones under her looked like someone had dumped buckets of paint all over them. She dropped the hose and scrambled backward, staring in horror at the mess spreading across her yard. Mark had to cover his mouth to keep from laughing too loudly. He quickly grabbed his phone and started recording her from the porch, zooming in as she frantically tried to rinse the blue water away ironically, using the same hose still connected to his line. But the more she sprayed, the more the dye spread, staining the concrete, the wooden legs of her patio furniture, even the bottom of her garden fence. The smell of vinegar was overwhelming now, and Karen gagged dramatically. Waving her hand in front of her face and shouting at no one in particular, the commotion soon drew attention. Curtains in nearby houses twitched as neighbors peeked out. One man down the street even stepped onto his porch, frowning at the noise. Karen, realizing she was being watched, tried to regain her composure. But it was impossible with her yard looking like a disaster zone. The harder she scrubbed, the worse it got. Her once pristine garden path looked like a tie-dye project gone wrong, and the sour smell made the whole scene almost comical. Mark kept filming, his chest shaking with suppressed laughter. Every second was better than he had imagined. Not only was she exposed, but she was exposed in front of witnesses. He knew the footage from his hidden cameras would also show the whole thing, from the moment she attached the hose to the moment the blue water sprayed across her flowers. She couldn't deny it now. He had everything he needed, as Karen finally gave up and stood in the middle of her stained yard, hands on her hips and fury etched on her face. Mark stepped out onto his porch, holding his phone up. "Everything okay over there, Karen?" he called, his voice dripping with mock concern. She spun around, her face red, her clothes splattered with blue streaks. "You did this," she screamed. "You vandalized my property." Mark raised an eyebrow. "My property? It's funny because my cameras show you stealing water from my line." "Looks to me like you did this to yourself," Karen sputtered, pointing at him with shaking hands. "You'll pay for this. This is harassment." But even as she shouted, a few neighbors had started filming too, phones held discreetly in their hands. They had all seen her shrieking and scrambling in the blue mess. Her reputation, already shaky, was now taking a public beating. Mark knew she was panicking, trying to find any excuse to turn this around. But there was no way out. The evidence was too clear, the humiliation too obvious. Mark simply gave her a small, satisfied smile. "Enjoy your garden, Karen. Smells lovely this morning." Then he turned and walked back inside, leaving her to rage in her blue-stained yard while the smell of vinegar hung in the air. Karen stood in the middle of her yard with her mouth open, staring at the chaos around her.
Ow.
The once perfect white stepping stones were splattered with blotches of bright blue. Her expensive patio chairs were dripping with streaks of color, and her shoes looked like she had stomped through a bucket of paint. The sharp, sour smell of vinegar filled the air, drifting into the street and making neighbors wrinkle their noses. For someone who prided herself on appearances, on being the queen of the neighborhood, It was a nightmare she couldn't hide. Mark leaned casually against his porch railing, phone in hand, still recording. His lips twitched as he fought back laughter, but inside he was savoring every second. After weeks of paying inflated water bills, after the smug threats, after being told he should be grateful she was using his resources, he finally had the upper hand. He had proof, witnesses, and her own arrogance working against her. Karen, however, wasn't ready to admit defeat. She stomped across her stained patio and marched toward his property, her blue-streaked shoes squishing against the grass. "You vandalized my yard?" she screeched, waving her arms wildly. "This is destruction of property. I'll have you arrested." Mark stayed calm. He had expected this reaction. "Karen," he said evenly, raising his phone so she could. "See the red recording light? You hooked your hose to my line. I've got it all on camera. From the moment you touched my sprinkler valve to the moment that blue water hit your stones. You vandalized your own yard?" Her eyes widened when she saw the phone, and for the first time, a flicker of panic crossed her face. But she recovered quickly, planting her hands on her hips and tilting her chin up defiantly. "That's not proof. You can't prove it's my hose, my hands, my yard. Besides, as a board member, I had authority to cut her off. Authority to steal from me? Authority to cost me hundreds of dollars on my water bills? You've crossed the line, Karen, and now you've exposed yourself in front of half the neighborhood, as if on cue, 2 curtains across the street." Twitched, a neighbor walked onto his porch with his phone out, clearly filming too. Another stood on the sidewalk, pretending to water his own plants, but openly watching the drama. Karen's cheeks flushed crimson. She realized too late that her meltdown wasn't happening in private. People were seeing the truth. The sour smell grew stronger as the blue water pooled in her flower beds. She waved her arms at the neighbors. "Stop filming. This is harassment. You're all going to regret this," she shrieked, her voice cracking. She grabbed the hose again and tried spraying the stains, but the more she sprayed, the bigger the mess became. The dye spread across her walkway like spilled ink, dripping onto her freshly trimmed bushes and leaving faint blue streaks on the lower leaves. Mark couldn't hold it in anymore. He let out a laugh, loud enough for her and everyone else to hear. "You should really invest in your own water supply, Karen. Looks like mine doesn't agree with your style." That only made her angrier. She dropped the hose and stormed closer to his porch, pointing an accusing finger. "You're finished here, Mark? I'll have the HOA fine you so much you'll wish you never bought this house." At that moment, another figure stepped out from a nearby house. It was Mr. Jenkins, the HOA president, a quiet man who rarely got involved in neighborhood drama. He lived just 2 houses down and had apparently been woken by all the yelling. He walked over slowly, hands in his pockets, and stopped near the property line. His eyes scanned the scene, the blue water, the sour smell, the hose connected to Mark's valve. His eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't speak at first. Karen immediately pounced on the chance to save herself. "Oh, thank goodness you're here, Mr. Jenkins. You need to find him right now. He poured chemicals into my yard. Look at this disaster." She gestured wildly at the mess, as though she were the victim of some cruel attack. "He's dangerous. This is an attack on a board member." Mr. Jenkins raised a hand calmly. "Karen, why is your hose connected to his sprinkler line?" For a moment, silence hung in the air. Karen's face twitched and her eyes darted around as she searched for an excuse. It's community upkeep," she stammered. "As a board member, I was ensuring proper watering schedules for property maintenance. It's part of my responsibilities." Mark couldn't help but laugh again, shaking his head. "Community upkeep? At 5 in the morning? Is my water running through your flower beds and staining your patio?" He turned his phone toward Mr. Jenkins. "I have the entire thing on video. I've got cameras set up at the valve box. 2. Would you like me to send them to the board?" Karen's confidence cracked. "You can't. That's invasion of privacy," she shouted, her voice shrill with desperation. Mr. Jenkins sighed. "It's not invasion of privacy. If he's recording his own property, Karen, and from what I see, you were tampering with his water system, that's a serious violation." The words hung heavy in the air. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but no sound came out. For once, she didn't have a quick excuse or a way to twist the rules. She stood frozen, her stained shoes squelching as the dye spread further into her yard. By now, more neighbors had gathered. A couple walking their dogs stopped at the sidewalk to watch, whispering to each other. Another leaned out from her porch, holding her phone high to capture the scene. Reputation, carefully built through years of intimidation and false authority, was crumbling in real time. Every second she stood there, blue stains spreading at her feet. Her power slipped further away. Mark lowered his phone, satisfied that he had more than enough footage. "You've embarrassed yourself, Karen, and I'm done paying for your water. Bills, next time you touch my property, I'll go straight to the police with the video." Karen let out a frustrated wail and turned back toward her house. She yanked the hose away from the splitter, water spraying across her dress as she did. She stomped into her yard, muttering curses under her breath, while neighbors shook their heads. The sour smell of vinegar lingered behind her like a trail. Of shame, Mark finally stepped back inside, closing the door gently, but his heart was racing with adrenaline. He leaned against the wall and laughed, almost unable to believe how perfectly the plan had worked. Not only had she been caught, but she had humiliated herself in front of everyone. The neighborhood had seen the truth, and now, even the HOA president was aware of her theft. The balance of power had shifted, and for the first time in weeks, Mark felt truly at peace. Meanwhile, Karen spent the rest of the morning scrubbing her stones with a brush, her hair tied up messily, her face red from effort and embarrassment. No matter how hard she tried, the blue stains clung stubbornly, and the sour smell wouldn't leave. Every time a car drove by, she ducked her head, terrified someone was laughing at her. But deep down, she knew the damage was already done. The neighborhood would never look at her the same way again. The days after Karen's blue disaster were filled with whispers and side glances around the neighborhood. For years, she had strutted through the community as if she owned it, handing out warnings, writing up fines, and intimidating anyone who dared to cross her. Now, when people saw her walking her dog or dragging her trash bins to the curb, they didn't look away in fear. They smirked, whispered, and sometimes even laughed openly. The once untouchable HOA board member had become the neighborhood joke, and she knew it. Mark, meanwhile, felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in months. His water bill dropped back to normal levels, the damp patches in his yard disappeared, and he could finally enjoy his mornings without worrying about sneaky footsteps near his sprinkler line. He didn't celebrate loudly or brag to anyone, but inside he carried the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been wronged and finally gotten justice. It didn't take long for the situation to escalate into official business. The HOA board called an emergency meeting to address the incident. Mark received a formal notice in his mailbox asking him to attend. At first, he hesitated. Part of him wondered if Karen would try to twist things, paint herself as the victim, and convince the board to punish him. But then he remembered the cameras, the videos, and the neighbors who had witnessed everything. He had nothing to fear. The evening of the meeting, the community clubhouse was filled with more residents than usual. Normally, HOA meetings were dull, attended by only a handful of people interested in landscaping updates or budget reports. This time, nearly everyone showed up, eager to see what would happen to Karen. The air buzzed with anticipation, and Mark could feel the eyes of his neighbors on him as he took a seat near the front. Karen was already there, sitting stiffly with her arms crossed. She wore a neatly pressed outfit and had her hair perfectly styled, but nothing could hide the faint blue stains still lingering on her white sneakers. She tapped her foot nervously, glaring at Mark whenever their eyes met. The HOA president, Mr. Jenkins, cleared his throat and called the meeting to order. "We're here tonight to discuss an incident involving alleged misuse of utilities and property tampering between two residents. Both parties will have the chance to present their side, and the board will make a decision." Karen immediately jumped in, her voice dripping with false confidence. "I'd like to start by saying this entire situation has been blown out of proportion. I was acting in the best interest of the community when I used Mr. Mark's water line to keep our shared property looking beautiful. As a board member, I have the responsibility to maintain neighborhood standards. What he did to my yard dumping dye and chemicals was malicious and targeted harassment. I demand he be fined and formally reprimanded." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. A few neighbors rolled their eyes, and one even chuckled under his breath. Everyone remembered the sight of Karen flailing in her blue-stained yard. Mark stayed calm. When it was his turn, he stood and held up his phone. "With all due respect, everything she just said is a lie. I have video proof from multiple angles showing her tampering with my sprinkler system, attaching her hose, and using my water for her own yard. This has been happening for weeks, which explains my skyrocketing water bills. I didn't vandalize her property. She vandalized it herself when she stole my water and triggered the trap I set in my own system." He walked forward and handed the phone to Mr. Jenkins, who connected it to a projector. The room fell silent as the video played. First came the footage of Karen crouching by his sprinkler valve, twisting the knob and connecting her hose with practiced ease. Then came the moment the bright blue water sprayed across her yard, staining everything it touched. The sound of her shrieking echoed through the speakers, and a few people in the audience couldn't help but laugh. Karen's face turned red, and she sank lower in her chair. "That video is taken out of context," she shouted, but her voice cracked, and nobody seemed convinced. Mr. Jenkins paused the video and looked around the room. "We also have witness statements from multiple residents who saw or heard the incident. Combined with this footage, it's clear what happened." He turned to Karen. "Tampering with another resident's property and stealing utilities is a serious violation. You've abused your position on the board, and as of this moment, you are removed from your role." The room erupted in murmurs, some shocked, others relieved. Karen's mouth dropped open in disbelief. "You can't do this to me. I've given years of service to this community," she cried, her voice rising in desperation. But Mr. Jenkins remained firm. "Your behavior has been unacceptable. You'll also be fined for theft of utilities, and if you refuse to pay, the board will take legal action. Consider this your final warning." For once, Karen had no comeback. She sat frozen, her face pale, her hands trembling. She looked around the room for support, but all she saw were cold stares and smirks. The neighbors she had bullied for years were finally seeing justice served, and none of them were willing to defend her. After the meeting, several residents approached Mark to shake his hand or pat him on the back. "You finally put her in her place," one said with a grin. "We've all wanted to do that for years," another added. "She'll find me for leaving my trash can out 10 minutes too long." "I'll never forget this day," Mark smiled politely, though inside he felt something deeper. It wasn't just about winning against Karen. It was about proving to himself that he didn't have to let people walk all over him. It stood his ground, found a clever way to fight back, and made sure. The truth came out. Karen, meanwhile, disappeared quickly after the meeting, her head down, avoiding eye contact. The days that followed were even worse for her. Word spread quickly beyond their neighborhood, and soon even people from nearby communities were joking about the woman who dyed her yard blue with stolen water. Every time she stepped outside, she felt the weight of mocking eyes. The blue stains on her patio took weeks to fade, and the sour smell of vinegar lingered even longer, a constant reminder of her humiliation. For Mark, life returned to normal. His water bills stayed steady, his sprinklers ran only when he wanted them to, and his mornings were peaceful again. He spent more time enjoying his garden, often smiling when he noticed Karen's yard looking patchy again, now that it was left to her own care. Neighbors who once avoided confrontation began greeting him warmly, treating him like the quiet hero who had finally tamed the neighborhood bully. One Saturday morning, as he sat on his porch sipping coffee, he heard laughter from across the street. A group of kids rode their bikes past Karen's house, pointing at the faint blue stains that still lingered on her stones. "That's the Smurf house," one of them shouted, and the others burst into giggles. Karen yanked her curtains closed in frustration. Mark chuckled softly into his mug. It wasn't revenge he felt anymore, but a sense of balance. Karen had stolen from him, bullied him, and tried to twist the rules to control him. But in the end, her arrogance had been her undoing. She had fallen into her own trap, exposed in front of the very people she wanted to impress. And now, the neighborhood was free from her constant threats. Weeks later, the smell of vinegar finally faded, but the memory of what happened didn't. Neighbors still joked about it at gatherings, telling new residents the story of the time Karen stole water and painted her yard blue. It became part of the neighborhood's unofficial history, a cautionary tale about arrogance and entitlement. Mark never bragged or brought it up himself. He simply enjoyed the peace, the laughter of his neighbors, and the knowledge that sometimes justice didn't come from shouting or fighting. It came from being smart, patient, and letting people expose themselves. Every time he watered his lawn, he couldn't help but smile, knowing that the water flowing through his sprinklers was finally his and his alone. And though Karen still lived just a few houses away, she never dared to look him in the eye again.